working on light sources and shading. I've got some transparencies to show you that illustrates how when light hits an object and it doesn't pass through, you get a shadow at the bottom. That one was sun. This one's radial lighting, so when you're drawing from the light source. And then we have directional lighting or single source lighting, which is like a light bulb or, you know, some other close light. You're going to get more obvious shadows from this unless you're like at sunset or sunrise for linear light. I've got some other tools here which I use to set things up. Most importantly is my circle guide and a ruler. No one draws a perfect circle. It's just way easier to take out your circle guide and do your circles that way. I've got some copic markers that I've used for today's. I also have copic opaque white, which is a great way to add in your highlights after the fact when you have any problems with the design or maybe your marker's bled. Up top you'll see that there's 3 different types of blending techniques. There is, the first one I'm going to be working on is the back and forth technique, which I'm going to use orange for. You lay down your lightest color first and you try to get like a good amount of ink on the paper, but sometimes you can get too much and then you get feathering, which you'll see in just a minute. So the markers are yellow, red, 000, 2, 4, 16, and 18. I'm going to add each one on. So that takes, unfortunately, just a moment. And you'll see here, I'm already going outside the lines, partially because I'm just trying to be quick and get the ink on the paper, and partially because anything with red in it will feather quite easily because it just has, it's really easy to saturate the paper with red. After I have on this yellow, red 18, I'm going to go back to the 00 because you can still see the stripes on the page where the different colors end. And I'm going to add that in to get a blend. And then I'm not quite thrilled with how light the color looks, so I'm going to go back with some of my darker colors and add those in, and then you just go back and forth until you have the gradation you like. The important portion is to try to avoid the feathering I've got going on, and also the you don't want it to go all the way through the paper either because you don't want to stain your surface. Now, what's feathering? Feathering is when the ink goes outside the lines. You'll see it follows the pattern of like the paper out, so it doesn't go very specifically out, it kind of blobs. And that blobbing is not usually something you want for your work, although I can see where it could be useful. If you're doing like abstract work or something. I know that it is actually a technique used in watercolor specifically to make that, they use that specific following of the water pattern. So who knows? And now we're on to flicking. Flicking is where you start with one side and you flick the color across. And then you pick your second marker. So I've gone for blue and yellow. And the second marker across to just flick the color and you get the blend in the middle. This is where copic markers are really ahead of most of the other markers I've used because you get a really good blend and you can actually get all the colors you need out of fewer markers by doing something like this where you get that nice green in the middle. The one thing you want to be clear of is to make sure that when your marker does pick up the other color that you do bleed out the color that's not supposed to be there. So I always keep a piece of scrap paper and just use it between flicks so I don't end up with green at the beginning of my yellow. Won't happen as much with the blue because the blue is a darker color. Now onto tip-to-tip blending. Seriously, this is actually a Copic certified technique. You're going to put one color of ink onto another color of ink and use that as a blending way to blend it. The best way to do that is to take a light color and a dark color so that you can put the dark color on the light. Doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you want to blend two dark colors, and my suggestion then would be to get a separate piece of paper and test it out. Because while it's completely possible, which markers you choose will drastically change how the marker on the paper looks. So I've picked two dark colors here. I've picked yellow red, and I've picked blue. And I'm just putting the blue on top of the red, which is actually having the effect of getting it on both markers. And I'm laying down so you can see the effect is quite different on the two. And so I've decided to go with the blue and purple because you see the purple more clearly. And I'm just flicking it on to the page from the upper line so I can get more purple up top. You can see you have the most purple the first time it's laid down, and then it gets lighter. So use your own judgment for what you're looking for and how much blending you do. The funny part about this is it took so much just to get the purple color out of the red violet, which is pink, like pink color marker, because I had been putting it onto the blue and forgotten to bleed out the red violet color. If you're using the marker, like I'm using the blue here, it's bleeding out the marker as you're using it. So, take a close look after you finished using it, but it's not really going to be a huge deal with the one you're using. And I'm taking the blue to just tidy up the bottom, and you can see how it goes from blue to purple. These are the two markers I used. I'm writing down next to each one, so if you pause after it, you can look closely and see which markers I used, when and how. You just saw a moment the scrap piece of paper that I am using to bleed out the excess ink. Next, we're going to move on to our circles. First, we're doing linear light source, which is just like if you had a ball in the sun. This balls are going to be red. These spheres are going to be red. Phrasing. So I'm using 5 markers on the top one because you're going to get quite a highlight there where the sun is hitting a shiny surface versus a matte surface. And the bottom I am using as a matte surface, so I'm only actually using 4. Really, 3 is more than enough colors for that. There are other techniques you can use to get this. This is my chosen technique. So I've used 0 to for the ultimate highlight for red, and then I've moved on to 5, and I filled in most of the rest of the sphere. It's important to use the color in most of the piece because they all have a bit of a different tint, and if you stop right at the edge where you want to move over, blending is going to be more difficult and it won't quite look right. So I actually go on to red 17 and then red 29, and in some cases I follow it up with just a hint of red 59 at the very bottom where it's going to be the darkest. And in this piece, you'll also see me use opaque white, because if it's truly a really shiny surface, you're going to get a white reflection, or I mean the reflection of whatever color is around. If you had like silver or gold, you'd want to make sure your reflection actually had the colors of the item it was reflecting. But we're not, because that's kind of advanced. So just working out the extras, getting some blending in, adding in that white opaque highlight in the top one. The bottom one, you barely see a lot of difference, but you do still see it's a sphere because of the darkening. But the gradation has worked out really good for that matte surface. If you have any questions about how that works, just get a tennis ball and throw it into the yard and see how distinct a highlight you have on that. It's not going to be much of a highlight at all. And then after the nice dollop of paint is on, I take a dry brush around the edges just to smear it out a teensy bit so it blends a little better. Next, we're going to move on to the single source light, which, you know, could be a light bulb, could be a candle, just anything that's going to be much closer than the sun, because it gives you a really big spread of how the light is when it hits the surface. I know, so much full of technical stuff. So we're on to, I decided to use blue-green for my next set. I wanted a different color for each one so you could see that it was doable across the different color spectrums. And not just like your, you know, oh, it only really works out right with, you know, as I used red before. And the first one was blue-green 000. And then I believe I'm holding 2, 5, and 7, and 9. The colors for Copic markers are actually laid out so that you can specifically pick which marker you're going to use next by the number on the cap. It's not 100% accurate. Whenever you get to the earth tones, the E markers, those are pretty off when it comes to which ones work together. But just test it on a piece of paper beforehand and you'll see if it's going to work for what you want to have done. Which is just a good idea anyways. Always test your art products on a piece of throwaway paper before you use it. But make sure that throwaway paper is actually the paper you're using, because the paper you're using will actually change how the markers behave. I choose to use Strathhome 500 series for these. I like how much ink it holds versus marker paper, which you can blend much easier on a piece of marker paper, but it doesn't hold a lot of ink. So you might not get as much depth. Maybe I only have to use 3 markers to show that it's a different shade or if that it's a sphere. But you miss something in that in the depth with the less ink. Now in this one you can see I've put grass on the bottom, and that was actually intentional so you could see cast shadows. The shadows against the grass are going to be like where the grass hits the sphere are going to be much darker than just the regular shadows from the sphere. So your objects that like the spheres touch are important in your picture. So before you start coloring your piece, know what objects are in the piece and how they're interacting with your subject. The other interesting thing is that in this, when I'm doing the blue-green, some of it actually leaks into the grass because that just happens. You're gonna get it. But when I come back later to do the grass, the green that I put down actually pushes the blue-green back into the sphere and tidies it up because they both have that that alcohol base. And it's a great thing with the alcohol-based markers is that alcohol will affect how it behaves. The bad thing about that is if I got a bunch of ink on my board, which you can see a bunch of stuff on the board, but none of that is actually marker, it's actually ink. It will, but if I had copic marker on there that wasn't just a stain, like hadn't been cleaned up really well, it would pull the pigment back out of the surface onto the surface I was working with, which means if there was red behind where I had set down my paper behind the blue-green, we'd have purple again, and we wouldn't want the purple. So now I'm working in just green, and that's green 000, and I'm just going the other way just to show you a different surface actually. We're gonna color the sphere the same way as the other, except a little bit lower on the ball. I wanted it sphere because I wanted it to really show how a shadow is going to stretch further the lower to the ground your light source is. So like twilight shadows are much longer than noonday shadows, which are shorter than 3 p.m. shadows. So it really changes, and you can use the transparencies I was showing you, and I don't have anywhere to buy those. Someone gave them to me, and they made them, so I guess you could probably find somewhere that sells transparency and just print lines on them if you have the ability to print on transparency. But you'll see like anywhere that light hits it can't pass through the sphere, so that's where you have shadow on the other side. So if these were clear, that would act differently and you would not have as much shadow. It'd be really light shadow on the other side because it would just bounce the light around a little bit, being glass. Plastic and glass actually act different as well, and that is an advanced technique, so I am not really going to cover that today. I should probably cover it with myself at some point and make another video if you guys aren't all bored out of your minds from this one. I know, technical talk. So I almost have these circles done. The blending is going in, and I'm really happy with how these have blended out. I think it looks really nice that they don't have a lot of jerkiness between the color layers. In fact, the red, it looks almost like just one color. You have to get really close to see it's different. And I may have, if I were doing this for a piece, I may have gone in and added a darker red underneath just to really highlight that it's a sphere. But spheres don't always look really drastically different, so that's going to change based on your setting as well. And I believe now I'm going to be putting in grass. Yep. And this is just, first I'm going through the same technique with the light green and hitting up the blades of grass. I'm actually using this time to push the blue color back into the ball so that it's not just on my grass. So you see I come mostly from the bottom and go up the first time through to push the alcohol in front of the pigment. And that's where the light's going, and you can see what I've been saying about how the shadow is going to go out. That shadow almost hits, in fact it does hit the red ball, but I foreshorten it a little here just so that it doesn't get too muddy in the picture. We will be posting this picture so you can look more closely at the things I've written on the page, which my handwriting isn't the best, but hopefully after watching the video you'll know what I'm talking about. Now I'm going back with the darkest color and adding in just where the grass is shadowed, because while the grass is kind of touching the sphere, not all that grass actually has to be still under the sphere. So you're going to have shading in the grass as well. So I just shade the back half of the leaves of grass, the blades of grass, that's the right word. And then I hit everything up with the medium to blend the light and dark. You might want some really stark colors there, some obvious differences, and might choose to skip the medium color altogether. I see people do it. It's a stylized choice. It's up to you what you want to see at the end of your art. And I'm going to repeat that with the bottom piece. So if you didn't get something at the beginning, I'm coming from the same angle, I'm doing the same techniques. Apparently I didn't have any blue on the grass because I went from the top to the bottom. And then I'm going to go in with a dark pen again, put in those shadows. The cast shadows are already on the sphere, so from when I did the coloring of the sphere. Now, if you get too much ink into your blades of grass, you can actually push them into the color. So have a bit of a light hand with extra small spaces. But it's wonderful that so much of the Copic set is changeable. Now here I wanted to show the really sun low on the horizon, light almost at the same level as the piece. And first I'm putting in just the lightest color again. Most of the colors the shading that we've used for these pieces is the back and forth technique. I do use the tip to tip shading a lot in pieces to achieve colors that I don't have, but I rarely use flicking. I just find it less controllable than I like. And now you see I'm just dotting the darkest color along the backside of the dirt or sand because I want to get a texture. I want you to be looking at it and see sand. And then I come in again with the medium. I do the same thing. I don't go back over this one with the light color because that will blow out all those little specks I just put in, and it won't hold. They'll just be smooth again, and then I'll have to wait for it to completely dry to come back in and add in the dots again. Again, you can choose to do that. I have before in order to give it a really good base gradation, but I find most of the time it's not worth it. It's more than you want. Now, because we're working on the red one, which had just a light, I'm using a gray because I'm going with a pavement or a solid surface, and the only place you get shadow is directly under the circle. So you just see that little itty bit. And then I put just a teensy itty bit underneath the next one. In the next set, these are radial lighting. So I went with the idea of a colored light bulb. And the top one is a translucent colored light bulb where you can still see inside. You see like the filaments normally. I didn't draw the filaments, but it's the idea of them. And the bottom one is matte because I wanted it to be able to show you the two differences. So the top one, you're barely going to see a color change. I got the lightest color orange in there to really show that it's translucent in theory. And the bottom one, I went through and filled that all in with the next darkest color because nothing is going to be as light as the translucent piece of like colored glass. That's unless it didn't have any color. And here is me just adding in just a teensy bit of color around the edge to show that it has an edge. And that's pretty much done for that one. And the bottom one, I'm going to add in a little bit more. But you still see that color, because it is the one putting off the actual light, it's darkest, it's barely going to get very dark at all because it's the light source. Again, that's why it has almost no shadow. You're only going to get shadow where the sphere is touching another surface, and that just in that space, because it's not possible for the light to go underneath it. Again, I want you to remember that the tools we used today were Copic markers. I used rulers and transparencies with guidelines for how light works. If I find a place who sells those, I will put them in the comments below. I'm not expecting to because it was something that was handed out in a class I took, and I believe the teacher had them printed. Some last little notes. I hope you had fun and learned a lot. If you have any questions, DM me at QQH_designs on Twitter. And here's just a few little bonus techniques. I am using the 0 marker to push some of the orange back in. You'll notice I'm flicking it on the side of the paper after each stroke because it will pick up the orange in the tip, which there's no point in putting it right back down where you don't want it. And stop before it's completely clear because that alcohol will continue to travel until it's dry. You can always come back again and try to remove or push some more, but if you have to start recoloring it, sometimes the edges don't work out quite right. And that's one trick for fixing those feathering marks. And the other trick is a secret. You know that paint we've been using, that opaque white Copic marker? It's not actually paint, it's actually opaque marker from Copic. I don't know how they do it, but it's a blessing. And I'm just going to use that along the tip blending side where you see a little blue out of the lines to cover that up. Now, if you do use that, you cannot color over top of it. So it has to be a white surface. And even then, you're going to want to come back and use a dry brush to feather it into your paper because a lot of papers, they're white, but they're not white. It's like the difference between off-white and eggshell and all of the other crazy names for that be white. I hope you have a lot of fun, and I hope you're enjoying your weekend. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
quack.